So, what do you know about the book of Micah? You probably recognize the famous quote from today's reading and from the children's sermon. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? But you probably actually know more than that. You just don't know that you know it, yes. Here's another famous one from Micah. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And there's another one that we get around Christmas time every year. It's echoed in the New Testament. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from ancient days. So, while we're familiar with some of the words of Micah, do we actually know anything about the prophet? I would guess no, partly because I had to do a lot of research this week too, and I went to school for 3 years to learn this stuff. So I'm guessing that you all probably don't know it all offhand either. Well, what we do know is it seems Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah, roughly 700 years before Christ. But he was very different from Isaiah. Isaiah was a wealthy man. He was an inside critic. He lived in Jerusalem, had access to the king's court. He was able to criticize the life of the people and the religious authorities from the perspective that you get living among them. Micah, on the other hand, was a rural man. He lived away from the centers of power. He saw that the policies of the government had an effect on the hardworking people of the towns far away from that big city. For all intents and purposes, Isaiah lived in Washington and Micah lived in Marion. There's a different side of things I think you see when you're Isaiah and you live in the center of power. You're blinded by what you consider normal and how everybody lives. You stop thinking about people who don't live the same way you do. And Micah's main job as a prophet was to help people remember what it was like for an average Judean farmer in his own day. He was constantly reminding people of the real human cost of war. He was there to remind the government what happened when they overtaxed the people. He was there to demand justice and equal treatment for everyone, and not just the wealthy elite with access in Jerusalem. It's pretty much what Micah's whole life was about. On a completely different note from Micah, I used to watch Law and Order marathons on TV all the time. I'd say like 7 or 8 years ago, TNT had a Law and Order marathon on pretty much every Saturday. And so if I had nothing to do, or I just didn't feel like doing my homework, I would sit around and watch. So if you've never seen Law and Order, it's an hour-long procedural drama about police officers and lawyers. And to prove to you that I watched a lot of Law and Order, I'm going to give you the opening monologue from Law and Order, because there's this thing that comes, the screen goes black, and then hear this guy with this voice. He says, in the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police, who investigate crimes, and the district attorneys, who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. So that's how every episode starts. And the show is an hour, but it's split into these 2 half-hour sections. And the first section is the police investigating. And then the DAs in the courtroom try to convict in the second half of the show. Now, the police half of the show is really interesting. You get to kind of know the bad guy, you get to know the circumstances, and the cops, especially Jerry Orbach, if anyone's a Jerry Orbach fan, he's pretty awesome, has some pretty good one-liners. But the heart of the show, the real drama, is in the second half of the show. The defendant enters the courtroom, and we get to see this person put on trial for their crimes. Now, many of you have met my friend Josh. He comes and visits every once in a while. He's the best man in my wedding, and he's the one who's studying to be a rabbi. He stops in Sioux Falls once a month or so. His father is a lawyer, actually. His father's name is Greg. And Greg said that Law and Order and shows like it give people this huge misconception about what courtrooms are actually like. He says that we over-dramatize this ideal because we watch too many movies and too much TV. He says that basically in a courtroom, even in these high-profile cases, except for opening and closing arguments, lawyers are never standing. But the thing is, it's really boring if you watch the show and the lawyer is sitting the whole time, so they get up and they do this, sort of ask the question and turn dramatically to the jury, but it's really not like that, since it makes for bad television. So today's passage from Micah, interestingly, is a bit of a courtroom drama in its own right. It's maybe not as dramatic as an episode of Law and Order, but that's only because, I think, we can't see it. We have to imagine it instead. Reading just the little section that we read today, it's a little confusing because it's not precisely clear who the accuser is and who the accused is. But if we go back to chapter 5, it becomes a lot clearer. In the 5th chapter, we get this sort of setup where Micah is explaining what is going to happen. The people of Judah, he says, are going to be attacked by surrounding nations. These more powerful armies surrounding them. And they will survive it against all odds, Micah tells them. And this did actually happen in the year 701. The powerful Assyrian army attacked Judah, and they were defeated. Then in chapter 5, Micah reports that God says that all the various forms of idolatry that are going on surrounding the people of Judah, in other words, in the surrounding nations, will need to be cut out so that the people of Israel can flourish. This means the sorcerers, necromancers, idol worshippers, etc., etc. Once that is done, Israel is meant to be a light to the nations, a sign to all that God is the only way and comfort. And after that section, we have this kind of sudden transition into a court case, in which we see God and the people in a courtroom, for all intents and purposes. The language, if we study it, is very much like the court language of the time. The people are acting as the accuser, and God as the defendant in this courtroom drama. But before the people can make their case against God, even before the people have the chance to make the first accusation, God jumps in. And God reminds them of salvation history. God decides to point out how many times the people have been saved. And this is accomplished using just a few buzzwords, really. In the text, it mentions Moses, Aaron, and Miriam in verse 4. That's meant to be a reminder of the exodus from Egypt, freedom from the yoke of Egyptian slavery. In verse 5, there's a reference to King Balak and Balaam, which is a reference to Numbers 22 to 24, in which King Balak of Moab hires Balaam to prophesy against Israel. Only Balaam can't do that because he is compelled by God to bless Israel instead. And finally, in verse 5, there's also a reference to Shittim to Gilgal, which is a reminder of the borders, the boundaries of the state of Israel, reminding the people that God gave them a homeland on this very spot. So now God has jumped in before the people could make their accusation, kind of turning the whole case upside down. And an interesting thing happens. The people who should now be ready to make their accusation against God see that their case is destroyed before they even had the chance to make that case. They realize, in fact, God has been good to them. And they're struck by their own inability to ever pay God back for what they have received. So instead of making a case against God, as they had planned, they ask a question instead. They say, "We have been disobedient. How can we make it up to you?" This time, when God is supposed to answer, well, that doesn't happen either, because another interruption comes, this time from the prophet Micah. And Micah steps in to tell them that they have already been told what the Lord requires. To do three things: to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. And that verse is very meaningful to a lot of people, I think, because it has a good rhythm, it's sweet, it sounds really good. But what do those three things mean? And I think the fact of the matter is, none of it matters if that's how we show our gratitude to God. Doesn't matter if we know that if we don't know how to do those things. So I spent some time this week actually jumping in and diving into my Hebrew, which is not something I do very often, but it was a useful thing to do this week, to look things up. The first thing that the people are asked to do is to do justice. It's probably the easiest one of the three petitions to understand. Its meaning is obvious: to treat other people in a way that is kind and just. It means giving up of what we have in order to help others in need. It also means, from Micah's perspective, certainly, that when we are in a position of power, it is unfair to use that position to our own advantage and personal gain, but rather we must use it fairly. It means that no matter what we have against another person, we acknowledge in our dealings with them that they are a reflection of God's own image, and how we treat other people is a reflection of how we treat God, so we are called to act fairly and righteously. The second petition here is to love kindness. The difficulty here is in translation. The Hebrew word for kindness here is chesed. And chesed is this word that we don't actually have in English. It can mean a number of things, and it does mean many, many different things throughout the Old Testament. Sometimes righteousness, grace, love, charity, mercy. It's often translated these days as loving kindness. And really, what that is a state of being accepting. Specifically, the best translation here is, in the sense of today's passage, is probably something between righteousness and grace. It means that we are supposed to love righteousness. We should have a love for doing the right thing. But it means, on the other hand, that we're also supposed to have a love of mercy. That is, we are supposed to be able to forgive others when they do not do the right thing. In fact, as I thought about it more, I decided that maybe the best word we could use is goodness. We are supposed to love goodness, all things that are good, including when things don't go our way, but both people who have succeeded and people who haven't. This is a very difficult thing to do, and I would argue probably more so in difficulty than doing justice. Finally, we reach the third petition. We're asked to walk humbly with God. I think this needs a little clarification, because what on earth does humbly mean? How does one walk humbly? Is it just walking with your head hanging low? When I thought of that image, I kind of pictured the Charlie Brown after the football gets yanked away, and sort of walking with the head down. I don't really think that that's what we're asked to do at all. Not to walk as if we're humble, but rather, when we walk with God in our everyday lives, we're called to remember who God is and who we are, to have humility about what we are. It's about remembering that we are human beings and not God. Only God is God. And that becomes really important when executing the first two tasks on this list. For example, how do we do justice and remember that we are not God? Well, think about the phrase, taking justice into your own hands. The way that we mean that culturally, it's certainly not doing justice in the way that God asks. In fact, when we use that phrase, we mean it as a perversion of God's justice, because it neglects the second commandment here, in which we love mercy, and the third, in which we remember that only God is God. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do away with the criminal justice system we have in this country. After all, then there would be no Law and Order marathons for me to watch on a Saturday. But I am suggesting that we don't by ourselves become judge, jury, and executioner just because we perceive something as being wrong. This teaching from the book of Micah extends beyond just how we treat what we see as wrongdoing. Ultimately, it's about how we pay God back for the many times we've been saved. Now, Micah, of course, doesn't mention the grace that we receive through Jesus Christ. After all, Micah didn't know about Jesus, and even if he had, he probably wouldn't have said anything, since it wouldn't have made sense to people the first 700 years this prophecy existed. But the salvation given to us through Jesus Christ is something worth thanking God for every day of our lives. And since it is worth thanking God, Micah teaches us how to show that gratitude, and that it's not about making sacrifices in a temple or obeying laws. At the very least, it's not about codifying how we live every second of our lives so that we only tie our shoes with the correct one tied first. Instead, it's about making a bigger sacrifice. It's about turning our lives over completely to God. It's about trying to be more like God in every second, every day. It's about acting justly when we greet our neighbors, make purchases at a store, mete out punishment to our children. It's about loving kindness and mercy in how we give a sympathetic ear to someone in need, or try to understand the perspective of someone who disagrees with us. It's about walking humbly with God and recognizing that our own perspective on the world is human and limited. Our vision is not God's vision. We have only fragments of the whole picture. We must remember that in our dealings with others. Micah lived in a time in which people went about to show their devotion through what kinds of sacrifices they made. And Micah sees that this, in many ways, giving a fatted calf or a young lamb, is a broken system. God doesn't need a burning animal fat. What God needs is to see us living in ways that reflect the grace that we have received in our own lives. Now, that's too broad of a thing for us to number out in commandments. It's too dependent on the situation to say that there's just one way to do it all the time. Instead, I think, the takeaway for us today is that Christianity is a religion that struggles with two conflicting ideas. On the one hand, we argue that our works don't save us. Only God can save us. Nothing we will ever do will be good enough to merit our salvation. Yet on the other hand, we don't believe we have a free pass for behavior. We don't think we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, because we're also expected to do good. But Micah gives us a way to rectify these two contradictory ideas. That's that we live in gratitude. We view our actions not as a way to prove our worth, but as a way to show our thankfulness to God for the gifts we've been given. And we do that by doing what Micah asks of us in this passage. We live into goodness, not because we need to in order to get a reward. Instead, we have already received our reward. We've been given salvation through Jesus Christ. We've been given a God who loves and cares for us every day. We live into goodness as a gift to God, as a sign of gratitude for the things that we have already received. When we fail to live that way, we ask forgiveness. And when we succeed, we praise God for helping us to do that, and ask for the strength to do it again tomorrow. The ultimate test of our faith is our response to God's own goodness. If we truly believe that God has called us out and made us inheritors of this gift of grace, we should show it in our actions and in our lives. And how would we show it? We've been told already in the teaching from Micah today.